All right, let's get started. As you recall, we're not going to meet in person this week, so we're going to have an online lecture. What I'm going to do today is talk about some general professional concepts and some things that you need to be aware of in the workplace. We're going to talk about some financial operations, and we're going to talk about project initiation and project documentation, how projects get started, particularly in the consulting field, and just some general terms and concepts that you need to be aware of in professional and corporate environments. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up the presentation. Okay. So to start, I figure the first thing that I think is prudent for you as a sophomore or junior level engineering student as you are beginning the process of moving towards your degree, and I'm sure that a lot of you are interested in obtaining co-ops or internships or some type of position over the summer and obviously once you graduate. So I figure it's a good idea to outline some general tips that I would have for you for professional success. Some things I think just about everybody would agree upon that would market your ability to be successful in the field. So first off, dependability. I think it's probably one of the most key aspects of professional success. So never miss a deadline. And you know, I don't want this to get convoluted. I mean, I know there are instances where deadlines get extended that's completely out of your control. This is really talking about the things that are well within your control. Basically, it's going along the lines of don't be late, always be available, and always, get your tasks that are within your control done on time. Being available and never missing deadlines is how you're going to ultimately get more responsibility, get more duties, and that'll potentially lead to promotions and maybe raises down the line. Another thing is to give it your all, to do every task as well as you can. On day one, if you're in an internship or a co-op opportunity, I mean, it's not that unheard of that on day one you're not going to be designing a multi-million-dollar bridge. On day one, you might be doing some basic CAD, some office work, some material testing and things like that. That's not that unheard of for an internship opportunity. Well, do it as well as you can. The bullet I have here is sweep the floor as well as you can if that's the assignment. And that's a little bit of a stretch, but the idea is, your superiors and the folks running the show are going to notice. The idea is that if you can't even be trusted to sweep the floors, and I use sweeping the floors as an example, but it could be pretty any routine or lower level engineering task. If you can't even sweep the floor, how are they going to trust you with more intricate and more complicated tasks and stuff that is a little more serious? If you can't handle the simple stuff, you certainly can't handle the complicated stuff, and so that'll cause a stagnation point in your career. There's an old saying that your undergraduate degree, your college degree, all it does is get you your first job, and that's it. Everything past that is your experience and your work ethic and your reputation. And so it starts by being dependable and working hard. Another thing that I think is critically important in the professional arena is communication. Communication. As an engineer, and this is particularly true of our field, but this is true of other fields as well, you're going to be working in a team. Very rarely is an engineer working in a black box. It doesn't really work like that. If you're a bridge engineer, there's a lot of different aspects that you have to pull together to make a project a success. It's not as simple as just, here's point A, point B, design a bridge that's this long. There's a lot of things you have to pull together. There's permitting, there's hydraulic opening requirements, there's right-of-way, there's surveying, there's all sorts of different aspects, and so you're going to be working in a team environment. And I use bridges just as an example because I'm a bridge engineer, but this is true of not really just engineering, but professional settings in general. And effective use of your resources and effective implementation of work always begins with communication. So you want to make sure you're communicating what you need, what you're doing, etc. Another thing, and this last bullet sort of feeds into the second one, but go above and beyond the call of duty. And what I mean by that is, you're working on a project and you see something that needs to be done, as long as you're not stepping on anybody's toes or breaking the chain of command, again, communication. If something needs to be done, do it. As long as you're communicating, and again, I don't want this to get convoluted. Make sure it's something that you're qualified to do, that you're doing it safely and all that. But the idea is just ensuring that things get done, taking responsibility. Again, your superiors will notice. All right, a couple other just general aspects, some tips, and this is just some things that you might experience or you might see when you get into professional settings. So in regards to positions and promotions, everyone has to serve their time in the trenches. And so I would say this is probably more geared, or this slide is more geared to those of you who go into private consulting land. This probably isn't really going to be the case in government work, or it isn't doesn't tend to be as much the case in government work. But the idea is, first off, accept the position even if it's not the dream position. Let's say it's your dream to design cars for Toyota, and Toyota gives you an offer, but it's not in the design section. It's the quality assurance section. And so you're working at Toyota, but it's not what you wanted to do. Accept the job. Okay? You'll learn the company, you'll learn the process, you will learn that aspect of the company's operation while you're there, and it'll get your foot in the door. Everybody's got to serve their time in the trenches, so your day one job might not be your dream position. I think it's okay to communicate what you really want. I think it's okay, if Toyota, let's say, gives you an offer, accept it, tell them, hey, I want to move up in the company. This is what my dream is. I think that's fine. I don't think there's any issue with that at all. If anything, it's conveying, it's communicating. It's conveying your honest intentions within the corporation. But take the job. If you refuse that job, it might be the last position you ever offered. So, if you're an engineering student, you're getting ready to graduate, and you have one offer on the table, take it. If you have two offers on the table, then maybe there's some decision that needs to be made, and some thinking that needs to be done. But in the end, like I said, your degree gets you your first job, so accept it. One other point, and again, this is really where consultant, those of you that work in the consultant field, this is a point I want to make to you. The folks that are up top, the senior management and things like that, they might get more latitude and leniency on things. They might get longer vacations. It might go down as simple as getting longer lunches. And so you show up on day one and you see these folks who are above you who are taking these long lunches and doing these long things. Don't let that get to you. They serve their time in the trenches too. So you'll get there. So don't get jealous or let that rub you the wrong way, because that certainly isn't the case, and you'll get there too. All right. In regards to company management, a couple things. I think you should, wherever you work, and this is anywhere, government, consulting, manufacturing, construction, wherever, know the company, know the management structure of the company. I think it behooves you as an employee to understand that administrative structure. You want to know names and you want to know positions. You just want to know who is in charge of what. If you're in a meeting and there's somebody there and they happen to be vice president of so-and-so, it'd be good to know that before you walk in the door. I think a good rule of thumb is to always look up to 2 levels in management. The idea is try and make your boss happy, but then make their boss happy. I think that's a really good recipe for success, because I think it'll pay off in the future. If your supervisor's happy and their supervisor's happy, I think it greases the wheels a little better for promotions and raises and things like that. But the big sort of caveat to that is to respect the chain of command. Don't ever go over your boss's head on anything. I think everybody knows what I mean. that is a surefire way to reduce your chances of promotions and raises, and might even cause you to be terminated. So always respect the chain of command. Okay, a couple other things about professional success. Let's talk about meetings. One of the things that you all will experience in your career is meetings. And then after that, some more meetings, and then after that, even some more meetings. You will be going to meetings upon meetings upon meetings throughout your career, period. And it doesn't matter if you go into government, consulting, construction. That's a part of your life, and it's a part of professional success, period. And I say meetings, conference calls, you name it. And so number one, this is especially true if you're the one convening the meeting. I think it's a good idea to send out an agenda prior to the meeting. I know that as somebody who attends quite a few meetings, not knowing what you're talking about before you go into the room is really difficult, especially if your meetings are project oriented. If you're trying to get something done and everybody shows up and they don't know what it is that they're responsible for, it makes the meeting quite difficult. Also, I think it's a good idea to set a time limit for each item on your agenda. So if you have an hour for a meeting and you have 6 items that you need to discuss, make sure, and if you're using the same time, make sure you're moving forward throughout the agenda. You don't want to spend 40 minutes talking about item number 1. You didn't even have time to talk about the rest, and they were all just as important. So make sure you're sticking to that. Okay. In regards to notes and correspondence, here's the facts. You might remember what's going on about a given project, and if you are somebody who has a photographic memory or eidetic memory or something like that, that's great. But there's a couple reasons why I think you need to take accurate notes and maintain proper correspondence. And this is true particularly for engineers. Number one, and it sort of relates to meetings, it does sort of set the stage for what, or sort of lay it out what you're responsible for, what other folks are responsible for. So, for instance, if you're at a meeting, and at the end of that meeting, you prepare what are called action items. Action items are, after a given meeting, assigning given tasks to given individuals. Okay, Rick, you take care of this. Sarah, you take care of this. Bill, you take care of this. It's not that uncommon right after the meeting either to send out minutes or an email that sort of documents what everybody is responsible for. Make sure that everybody is on the same page. So again, it goes back to communication. Another good reason for notes and correspondence is, for all you know, you're working on a project that's a 10-year project. The project's going to last 10 years. And you work on it from years 4 to 7, and that's it. So when you show up on year 4, you kind of need an accurate picture of what's going on. So you're relying on the person before you. You're relying on their notes and correspondence to understand where the project is at. And then when you leave the project, the person following you is going to rely on your accurate notes and correspondence. So, another aspect of taking proper notes is, again, for those of you who have a photographic memory, well, it's not just you. There are other key players and other members of a given project group that need to be made aware of what's going on as well. And finally, I think this is the more realistic reason for keeping proper notes and correspondence, is the facts are most of us don't have photographic memories or eidetic memories or whatnot. As much as you think you will remember why you decided what you decided, 10 years from now, you're not going to remember. Why did you go with this type of beam versus this other type of beam? Why did you change the geometry of the bridge so that the skew would be this angle as opposed to this? I mean, these are intricate decisions, and 20 projects and 6 years down the line, you're not going to remember why you made those decisions. So keeping accurate notes is critical. Apologies for belaboring notes and correspondence, but I do think it's incredibly, incredibly important. All right. So with that, I want to talk about some nuts and bolts, if you will, of the operation of a successful engineering company. And a lot of this is true for just companies in general, but I would argue that for engineering firms, and for engineering students, this lecture is particularly important because I don't think you see a lot of this in regular engineering classes. You're not talking about timesheets in dynamics. So I think this is a really critical lecture. So first off, let's talk about some financial documents. So obviously, if you're at a construction company or a consulting firm, you want to make money, you want to be profitable, so that means you need to track expenses and expenditures and profits and things like that. So the fundamental, most important financial document that everybody is going to interact with at some point or another is a timesheet. First off, a timesheet is a legal document, so treat it as one. The reason why is because timesheets are how clients are billed. So for instance, at the engineering firm that I worked at when I was in between semesters during my undergraduate degree, let's say I had for example, an 8-hour workday, and I worked on 3 different jobs. Well, let's say I worked 2.5 hours on one job, 3 hours on one, and then the remainder on another. Well, I would need to accurately track my hours on those particular jobs because those clients were going to be billed for my time. And so if that data was incorrect or was fudged in any way, that's litigious. That's grounds for a lawsuit. So timesheets are legal documents, so treat them as one. No one should be submitting a timesheet for somebody else. No one should be filling out a timesheet for somebody else. No one should be modifying somebody else's timesheet. It's the one thing that really you should have direct control over. Now, that being said, I don't think it's incredibly inaccurate to ensure, or incredibly unethical to ensure that everything is consistent. For example, going back to my previous experience during my undergraduate education, when I went out and worked on jobs at my engineering firm, I wouldn't be alone. It would be me and a crew. So if we were all out there for 2.5 hours, well, they all kind of need to read 2.5 hours because it wouldn't really make sense if I was out there, say, an hour longer than everybody else if we were all out there at the same time. So consistency, I think, is fine under the given circumstances, but again, your timesheet is your own. Also submit them when they're due. A lot of organizations sort of require this in some ways or another, but this is incredibly important. It can cause accounting issues if you don't submit them on time. It can cause legal issues if you don't submit them on time, so it's incredibly important. I have here an image of a timesheet just sort of by hand, one done by hand. I would imagine, when I worked at my firm, we did them by hand, but I would imagine a lot of places are now just sort of doing them online or have some sort of, software to collect these. Typically what you're doing is you're submitting a timesheet for a given week, and so on the left what you're doing is you're sort of organizing, let's say, tasks. You could also organize them by jobs. In an 8-hour workday, you might work on 2, 3, or 5 jobs, so you might put, let's say, your job number for each of those tasks. And then what you're doing is saying, okay, on Monday I worked this many hours, on Tuesday I worked this many hours, and on Wednesday, let's say I didn't work on this task at all, on Thursday I worked this many hours. So what you're doing, typically, when you're adding up a timesheet, the old adage when you do these by hand is you add up each task and then you add up each day and then sum those up independently to sort of ensure that on the bottom right that everything adds up. So let's say your weekly total is 11.5 hours. That's what ultimately that would be your billability for that week. Those would be your billable hours. So it's just sort of a way of ensuring everything you're doing is accurate. Okay, so that's your financial document. There are some other financial documents I think that are incredibly important. One of them is a balance sheet. So you might have heard of a balance sheet, but I'll sort of outline that somewhat specifically. So a balance sheet is sort of a snapshot, if you will, that in a nutshell summarizes the health of a company at a given time. So unlike a P&L statement, or which we're going to talk about here in a second, a balance sheet gives you the health of a company at a given singular point in time. So at this moment, what's the health of the company? And the health of the company is measured by 2 key quantities, the assets and the liabilities. So the assets So assets are basically all of the available resources that the company has, and then liabilities are its obligations, what it owes. And if there's a difference between the two, and hopefully that difference is positive, we call that difference equity. But when it's all said and done, the figures should balance at the end of the sheet, hence why it's called a balance sheet. So to give you kind of an idea, let's say that you own a car that's worth $15,000. So you personally own that car. That is an asset. But you've taken out a $5,000 loan on that car. Okay? So you own a $15,000 car, but you have a $5,000 liability on that car. So there is a difference between those two, and that difference is equity. So you do possess an equity with that vehicle, and that equity would be $10,000. But ultimately, you have $15,000 in assets and $15,000 in liabilities and equity, so it balances at the end. I have here an image of just a generic balance sheet from Paul's Guitar Shop, but ultimately this will give you kind of an idea. So for assets, what assets would a guitar shop have? Well, it would have maybe cash on hand, it would have inventory, any prepaid rent, any accounts receivable money that it's owed, that would be an asset, any long-term assets. As for liabilities would be things like, accrued expenses, the payable accounts, unearned revenue. Ultimately, there's a little bit of equity. The equity is about $22,000. So ultimately, we're doing pretty good with this guitar shop. But this is a very basic example of a balance sheet, so to give you kind of an idea of what we're talking about. Now, another document that's of importance is a P&L statement or an income statement. Now, unlike a balance sheet, so a balance sheet gives you a measure of a company's health at a given singular point in time, like a snapshot. A P&L statement is different. It will give you a summary of the health of a company over a range, over a period of time, over let's say for a given year. One term you might hear pop up is a fiscal year. So a fiscal year is the year that a given company defines its financial operations by. So that might be the calendar year. You might have companies or organizations that define their fiscal year from July to June. So the fiscal year ends, let's say, on July 30 or June 30th and begins on July 1st. Sometimes it's the end of September, beginning of October. And so usually, if you're working at a company and let's say the fiscal year is coming to an end, you'll probably see a lot of sort of accounting activity going on, ensuring that all of the records are properly kept. And usually the end of the fiscal year you see is kind of when it comes to accounting, can be a little bit of a rush period at a company. There's a lot happening. But you can see here when you're looking at an income statement or a P&L statement, you're looking at revenues and expenses to try and see how did the company perform over a given period of time. And I'll just sort of let you review that at your leisure. Now, also of importance to a company is the insurance that it carries. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of the concept of malpractice insurance. So malpractice insurance for, let's say a doctor who performs a surgery and makes a mistake, that they would be open to a malpractice lawsuit. Well, engineers have to carry a variety of insurance types as well. For engineers, the big one is error and omissions, or professional liability insurance. And there's a number of different types. There's general liability, professional liability, and you can have differences between claims made professional liability versus claim coverage when based on when the work was done, not when the claim was made, or claims made coverage trigger, covered at the time that the policy is in effect. If you're a company that owns automobiles, you need to have automobile insurance. Only the employees drive the automobile. So if you let your, let's say, significant other drive the company vehicle and they get in a wreck, that's bad. Don't do that. You might have umbrella liability for extra coverage beyond everything that's specific, workers' comp, things like that. So just be aware of these things. Okay. Let's talk about steps to obtain design work, and I think this is really going to be applicable to the folks in the consultant and construction field, and that can be true for civils, mechanicals, electricals, you name it. But basically anything that's, if you're not a government or a federal agency, then this is going to be critical. But actually, it might also be critical if you're in government or in the public sector. I mean, let's go back to bridges again. I'm a bridge engineer. There's two sides of the equation. There's the state, which is issuing the work, and there's the private companies, which are bidding on the work. So I think everybody needs to have a general idea of what's going on. So first off, let's talk about some different types of projects. So first off, public projects or large private agency projects. So this is where I think the process to obtain work and actually be able to work on a project can be a little bit more complicated, because usually there's a step-by-step process. It starts off with usually something like what's called an EOI, or an expression of interest request. What we're talking about here, let's keep in mind when we say public or very large project, we're talking about public projects, very, very large projects, something like the Burj Khalifa, or a major structure. We're talking about really, really large private agency. And when I say, actually, let me scale that back a bit. I mean, when I say when I say large private agency projects, this is probably something beyond like a house. Let's say an office building. Something that has some significant weight to it. So usually the developer or the public agency is issuing out an EOI, and that's kind of used to gauge who would be interested in proposing the work, and it's just sort of a very basic general understanding of the project at this point. So, excuse me. All right. Next comes the RFP. That's a request for proposal. That's when the firm actually or the public agency or whatnot, that's when they explicitly request proposals on the given project. And so, it's going to be a little bit, the information given is going to be a little bit more detailed, and the information requested is going to be a little bit more detailed. Usually you need to generate a task list, a cost estimate, and what have you. Now let's say you have a project and you have 50 people submitting bids. Usually the next process is what's referred to as shortlisting. So the idea is whittling down those 50 bids into a shorter list of firms that have submitted proposals where the proposal seems to make sense. And so I'm sure you've heard, the old adage that the lowest bid gets the job. Well, that's not always the case. If you have a project that's a $50 million project, it's going to cost around $50 million. You might have a firm that can be creative and say they can do it for 49 or maybe 48, but if somebody says they can come in and do it for 300 grand, there's probably something wrong with that proposal. So there is a review process. It's not just as simple as lowest bid. Once you have your short list, usually there's some sort of like formal interview. The firms make a formal presentation of understanding, why they should be selected, what they'll do. It's usually, a few staff members make a formal presentation in front of a panel. Maybe that panel is convened of, government employees or, private representatives of a given company, etc. Now, one thing worth mentioning, again, I'm talking about larger projects. If it's a small project, you might have the process be a lot simpler. It might just be as simple as, a direct negotiation between a client and a given consultant or contractor, and it's just a straight award or a negotiated fee. Okay. So lastly, let's talk about some of the responsibilities and documents and drawings that you'll produce as an engineer in a professional setting. So first off, specifications and drawings. So as an engineer, if you're successful, it's really one of the main things that you're trying to produce is the specifications and drawings. It tells the contractor what it is that they are to produce. Now generally, it does not tell you how, the means and methods. It's just here's what you need to produce. So for instance, if it's a bridge, you'll say, here's the bridge that needs to be built. Contractor, you figure it out. And that's sort of by design because it gives the contractor a little bit of freedom to, complete and fabricate and complete the structure in their own method. But also there's a liability issue. If you tell the contractor how to do the work and things go bad, the contractor will say something like, well, that's how the engineer told me to do it, and then enter the dreaded change order. We'll talk about change orders here in a little bit. So usually also you're not dictating an exact specific item unless there is a good reason. If it's a specialty item, if it's a project where there's really only one item or one element that can be used to complete it, you'll see this. So usually you're saying, okay, here's the item or equivalent, but more often than not, it's pretty general. Okay, next becomes the preparation of bid documents. So this is basically creating you're acting as the owner representative. You're creating a bid request. That bid request is advertised so that the contractors can submit bids. And again, so this is sort of summarizing the scope of the project so contractors can place appropriate bids. You're also answering questions for contractors. You're going to open the bids, tabulate them, verify that the bids are being made responsibly. Again, going back to my $50 million versus $300,000 example. And then you're in the selection process of awarding the work to a given contractor. Now, the term changed conditions or changed field and site conditions, that is the favorite phrase of a contractor. And it's absolutely hated by an engineer and an owner. So what that basically means is, I think this is particularly true in civil engineering, is the engineer designed a given system and contractor won the bid to go out and build that system. So the contractor goes out to the site and the site or the conditions on the site are different than what the engineer specified. So it's a way for the contractor to say, well, I expected the condition to be A, and it is now condition B. So because it's condition B, I need more money to complete the project, and enter the change order. So the change orders can be, first off, they can be administratively at all levels. They can go from the contractor to the owner. That's the most typical, but it can go from the subcontractor to a contractor. So if you're a general building contractor, you might have a sub for plumbing and a sub for the electrical and some sub for concrete work and painting and what have you. It can be from the design engineer to the owner. But change orders are basically, it's the formal way of charging the contract for extra work. And I don't want to say that they're not they're not always invalid. That isn't the case. I mean, there are instances where a change order is a very relevant and reasonable submission. But one point I'll mention, if a change order needs issued, I would always suggest that do it before the work is performed. So issue the change order before the work is completed, because it's going to reduce a lot of legal complications and headaches down the line. Imagine if you're a developer, a land developer, and your contractor issues you a change order and said, well, I need extra money to do this work that I already did, so you're on the hook whether you like it or not. It doesn't really give the owner or the client much room to make the decision whether or not that change order is valid. And so enter the world of lawyers and lawsuits and whatnot. And so it usually reduces conflict to just wait until the change order issue has been resolved. A couple other terms. You might hear the term value engineering, or VE, in a professional setting. So value engineering is when the contractor reviews the engineer's design and determines that there is actually a more efficient way to construct it. So let's say, let's use a bridge example. Let's say you're the engineer who's been selected to design a given bridge. So you design a concrete bridge, and then that concrete bridge goes out to bid, and a contractor wins that project, but the contractor says, you know what, it's going to be really expensive and really inefficient for me to erect a concrete bridge. Why don't I do some design work myself and see if I can come up with a cheaper option? So they produce a steel bridge, and they go to the client and they say, look, you need a bridge. Well, here's a steel bridge that'll do the exact same thing this concrete bridge will do, and it's 10% cheaper. So it's It's a common practice nowadays, especially in civil engineering, and I know it's very common in the bridge sector, to reevaluate a design. Who gets the savings? Well, it depends on the documents and whatnot, and depends on the agreement. Sometimes the contractor keeps the savings. Sometimes it's split between the contractor and the owner. It just depends on the contract. Shop drawings. So shop drawings are when a fabricator or a contractor produces drawings for construction purposes that are meant to interpret an engineer's design. So an engineer designs, let's say, I'll use a different example, let's say a machine or a mechanical system. So an engineer produces a design, and then a fabricator produces a series of drawings. This is what I need to build that design. So sort of sort of redrawing it out, but for a different purpose. The engineer is trying to convey the design to the fabricator. The fabricator is trying to convey the design to the folks who are actually going to be milling and grinding and cutting and welding, etc. The big thing to keep in mind from a liability standpoint is you should not be the one stamping shop drawings if you didn't prepare them. So if the engineer produces the design but the fabricator produces the shop drawings, it's not really the engineer's responsibility to stamp the shop drawings. The creator of the shop drawing stamps them. They should be stamped by the creator prior to your review as the designer. Memorandum of Understanding. This is sort of the outlines of a project agreement. So an MOU is sort of a soft agreement between two entities. It states the intention to do something on a given project, but it typically doesn't have a dollar value or really steep consequences with it. It's really just trying to ensure that the relationship is sort of locked in. You know, that, okay, we have an understanding that we're going to work together. We haven't hashed out all the final details. Really the big deal or the big reason for an MOU is to try and sort of establish a solid professional relationship moving forward. So if you're a client and you have a number of competitors bidding on something, an MOU is sort of a soft understanding that you're going to work with this company. It doesn't mean that you will, but it sort of paves the path moving forward. Terms and conditions. This is where things get a little more specific. It's payment terms, cross-hiring practices, basically limiting the liability amount, the length of liability, just stating in a little bit more of a formal setting what the client's responsible for, what the engineer is responsible for, etc. Project delivery. This is I'd say this is very primarily for the civil folks in the room. There are different ways that a project can be delivered. I'd say the most classic is a design bid build project. So a design bid build project is one where an engineer designs the system, and then the engineer and the client asks for bids, and a contractor builds it. And so there's two different entities. There's an engineer designer, and there's a contractor builder, if you will. And it's the classic way of doing things, but there can be some inefficiencies, if you will, from a QA/QC and a delivery standpoint. Design build is becoming a lot more common in the public sector and in the bridge sector in particular, but it's becoming common in other avenues as well. Basically, the idea behind design build is instead of the engineer and the contractor being separate entities, they're sort of one and the same. They're either working together or they are the same entity producing a given product. So if you're a DOT and you need a bridge, you go to this one organization and they will design the project, build the project, do it all for you, one-stop shop. It's usually contractor dominated, and contractors will just hire engineers to design accordingly. P3, you might hear the term P3. P3 stands for Public-Private Partnership. It's sort of where a public project is backed by some private entity or private firm or some sort of relationship between public and private money. A private firm could pretty much use any project delivery method, but the private firm recovers its money from the public agency over time or charges the users of the projects. This is sort of like where the concept of tolls come into play. So, you know, a private entity comes, for instance, a private entity comes in and, you know, does a lot of work on a highway that's for use by the public. And so the public gets a nice, shiny, brand new highway as long as they pay a small toll to use that highway. So that's an example of a P3 project. Last thing I think I should mention is the concept of teaming. So teaming is a very common instance in professional settings. Nowadays, when projects are getting, you know, very, very complex, it's not that uncommon for engineering firms to team up, and that teaming up can take on a variety of different relationships. So I'm going to go back to the bridge sector again. So if you have a project designing a very complex bridge, curved bridge, skewed bridge, really, really large spans, really complicated geometry, you know, there might be a team coming together to put that proposal together, because there are going to be some firms, some engineering firms, that's sole purpose and sole specialty is doing analysis of complex bridges, and you'll have another firm that specializes in a particular type of bridge design, and another firm that specializes in let's say, bridge construction, you know, practices. So usually you'll find, you know, smaller firms maybe combining to take on a larger project. You know, a lot of times, you know, in those instances, you'll have firms with different skill sets coming together. You might have large firms combining with smaller firms due to contract requirements. So, you know, you have this big project, and you got to team up to get it done. Some firms are, again, very analytical. So, I know this. What I'll say is this: I know that this presentation so far might have seemed like a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's been put together just to sort of, you know, appraise you of what fundamental concepts that we think that you need to be aware of in a professional setting. Again, you're not talking about this stuff in dynamics or thermo or circuits or something like that. But these are very real concepts that you need to be made aware of as you enter the professional setting. So whether it's general tips for success, understanding company operations and how to obtain design work, and various documentation and financial instruments and whatnot. Hopefully you found that this is a fairly valuable video. All right, that's all I have for this lecture. When we pick this lecture up next time, we're going to talk about specifically some things related to professional communication. We're going to talk about networking opportunities, and we are going to talk about the avenue of graduate school, because it is something that I think that every engineering student should consider. Not necessary, but it's something you should consider. But that's all I have for this lecture. We'll see you when we get back.